All right, what we're looking at here is an excerpt from Marvel's Bullpen Bulletins from November 1972. The Bullpen Bulletins page was the page where they would have announcements. DC had one. I think DC's called theirs Direct Current. But Bullpen Bulletins every month would appear in every comic that Marvel put out. And up in the upper left-hand corner in yellow would always be a special message from Stan Lee called Stan's Soapbox. Anyway, this particular excerpt talks about how Stan Lee and Roy Thomas had, quote, wanted to start a comic mag which dealt exclusively with the daring do of a gal superstar instead of the usual hunk of masculine muscle. So it talks about how they sat down to come up with an idea, and they actually came up with 3 ideas, and they decided to go with all 3 of them. And here they are announcing these. First and foremost, they say, the claws of the cat. That is going to be drawn by Marie Severin and written by Linda Fite, who was a former staffer at Marvel. Also, a title called Linda Carter Night Nurse, with Winslow Mortimer doing the artwork, and Jeannie Thomas, wife of Roy Thomas, at least at that time. They split up later, doing the scripting duties. And also the third one is one we just talked about a little bit ago, Shanna the She-Devil, which was illustrated by George Tuska and written by Carole Suling, whom they describe as a longtime comics buff. And indeed she and her husband, who would actually play a large role in the direct sales market later on. And she really didn't have any comics writing experience, and she never did too much other comics writing other than, I think, a few issues of Fawcett Publications' effort to get back into the comic business in the mid-70s. Anyway, point is, here in 1972, Marvel is seeing the need and the opportunity to expand into possibly new markets by having superhero titles or action adventure titles geared toward female readers, with at least one woman on the creative team of all 3. And in the case of the Cat, both the writer and the artist were female, although they did not create the character. The character was actually created, conceptualized, and designed by Roy Thomas and Wally Wood, doing the costume design. Now, looking at the claws of the cat, perhaps you will see a familiarity to this costume and think, well, clearly this is the character that will later be known as Hellcat, previously known as Patsy Walker from all those teen magazines or teen comics down through the decades. And that's a pretty good guess, but it is not correct. Actually, what winds up happening is that the cat, alias Greer Nelson, later mutates further and becomes Tigra later. Not too much longer, a couple of years after this. And then when they decide to make Patsy Walker, to bring that character back and make her a superhero, they essentially have her take over the cat's old costume. So kind of secondhand business there. Some other women working at Marvel in the 70s included Glynis Oliver, who was born in 1949 in England and as a teenager moved to the United States. In the early 70s, she started working as a colorist at Marvel Comics and would do so, doing quite a bit of the Marvel titles for the next 30 years until from 1970 to until 2000, when she retired as a colorist to become a cheesemaker, which I think is a really cool thing to become. Also, Louise Simonson. Well, I said the 70s. She actually started at Marvel in January of 1980. She had started at Warren Publications in 1974 as an editor and became the top editor there. Warren, remember, is that company that made the black and white horror magazines. Then she came to Marvel in 1980 as editor of the Uncanny X-Men, and she would edit several of the other X titles, including New Mutants, for the next few years until 1983, when she quit her job as an editor to write full time, and she wrote for several titles, including X Factor and later X Force, where she co-created the characters that you see in toy form there on the right, Cable and Apocalypse. She also in the late 80s started working on Superman over at DC, and she was part of the team that did that whole Death of Superman thing in the early 90s. And she still occasionally will write for both Marvel and DC right up until the present. Now, one thing that that I probably should mention is that several of the women who came on board the comics business in Marvel and DC in the 1970s were the wives or girlfriends of the men who were already established there. Now, that's not in any way to minimize their talent, quite the opposite. But if it seems weird that all of a sudden Marvel and DC are hiring all these women after 25, 30 years. Last time they did that was during World War II, when many of the male writers and artists were away at war. It's still things still had perhaps not progressed as much as one would hope, because in order to get into these positions, these very talented women had to happen to have a man that would basically campaign for them to get work, which, again, is not something that I am an idea that I promote or am celebrating. But you had Jeannie Thomas, Roy Thomas's wife, who did a lot of writing. Louise Simonson was married to artist Walt Simonson. Glynis Oliver was married to Lynn Wine, and she was known as Glynis Wine for a while. And there would be other examples of that. It wouldn't be until the 1980s, really, that large numbers, or comparatively large numbers, of women writers and artists were coming in without any previous connection to the company. Here is one exception to that in the 1970s. Mary Jo Duffy, who came on board at Marvel in 1978 as an editor. Now, her name was familiar to comics fans already, because throughout the 1970s she had been a frequent letter writer in the fan mail pages. So she came on board as an editor, and soon thereafter started getting writing assignments. She took over the title of Power Man and Iron Fist and had a run on that for a couple of years. And then she had, I think, a very memorable run on Marvel's Star Wars. I thought some of the best stuff that was done on that title, where she was for several years. Now, down through the years, she has continued doing occasional comics work, but right now, I believe, as of 2020, she's working at the U.S. Immigration Office. She's also been kind enough to interact with me and answer some of my questions about various things, for which I am very, very grateful. Questions about comic books, not about immigration. Ann Nocenti came on board Marvel as a writer in 1982, taking over the Spider-Woman title. She also did some writing for some of the X titles. She co-created Longshot, who's one of the mutants that was a member of the X-Men for a while. Probably best known for her 1980s and into the 90s run on Daredevil as writer of Daredevil. And she created some memorable characters there, especially some villains. Blackheart, who actually showed up in the second Ghost Rider movie, and most memorably the villain Typhoid Mary, who appeared on film a couple of years ago on Netflix's Iron Fist series. Well, now let's talk about some of the powerful women who were in the comic book business that were not necessarily on the creative side exclusively, but more in the more management, I guess you could say. And we'll start with this woman, Helen Meyer. Helen Meyer went to work for George Delacorte at Dell Publishing in 1923 when she was 16 years old as a part-time clerk. Now, you probably don't remember this. It's been many hours ago by this point, but when I first talked about Dell Publishing, I told you when they started. It was 1923. So she came in on the ground floor with George Delacorte and Dell Publishing and sort of worked her way up and gained the confidence of the owner of the company, George Delacorte. By the 1930s, she had encouraged him and really persuaded him to branch out from magazines to comic books when the comic book thing was just getting started in the mid-30s. Then in the early 40s, she encouraged him to try this new thing called paperback books. Also, in the 40s, encouraged him to branch out into hardcover, high-quality books with the imprint of Delacorte at that time. And she was in charge of that. And while she was doing that in the 40s, she signed such authors as James Baldwin and Kurt Vonnegut. Finally, in 1950, Delacorte put her in charge of the entire comic book division. So she was the president of Dell Comics, the first woman to be president of a comic book company. And she held that position for 26 years, taking it on just as the 1950s were getting started, just as the whole horror thing was underway. Now, even before she was president of the company, she had been instrumental back in the 30s when she had convinced Delacorte to start doing comic books. She had been instrumental in persuading him to look for licenses for famous characters, particularly from Walt Disney. So in a lot of ways, she was responsible for the comic book branch of the company's biggest success, because you remember how extraordinarily popular those were by the 1950s. She also was called to testify in April 1954 before the Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency to testify in response to Dr. Frederick Wortham. So her company was like the exact and complete opposite of EC Comics, right? As she emphatically stated on the stand, Dell Comics are good comics, and that became their motto. Also, high quality comics, as you can see there on the cover of Uncle Scrooge. Nonetheless, she did not have much use for Frederick Wortham and was plain spoken in declaring that to the Senate, because she, despite the fact that Dell had probably the most wholesome image of any comic book company, She was adamantly opposed to the Comics Code Authority. She was opposed to censorship of any kind. But everyone eventually had to sort of knuckle under on that one. So at that time, Dell, as of 1954, they were accounting for a full 1/3 of all comics sales in the U.S. So she was very, very successful. She left when she was in her 70s, and then she became a literary agent after that, and had quite a bit of success there, and represented some very famous authors. So Helen Meyer, remember her for sure. Also remember Jeanette Kahn, the second woman to be president of a major comic book company. Now, when Jeanette Kahn was just in her mid-20s, she launched and was the editor for several successful kids magazines. And in 1976, when DC sales were flagging and DC was consistently coming in, bringing up the rear now behind Marvel Comics, and had actually slipped, finally, after half a century almost, had slipped into second place in comic sales behind Marvel. Carmine Infantino was squeezed out as the head honcho at DC Comics Publishing there, which was by this time bought by Warner Brothers, still known officially as National Periodicals Publications. The ownership wanted to go in a bold new direction and get some young blood in there, and so here's this young woman who had her finger on the pulse of what kids like, apparently. And so at the age of 28, Jeanette Kahn became the publisher of DC Comics. A few years after that, I think 5 years after that, she also became president of DC Comics, making her not only the second woman to ever be president of a publisher and president of a major comics company, but also she was the youngest person, male or female, ever at that time, and so far as I know since, to get the position of division president at Warner Brothers. So she was on hand for over a quarter of a century, and DC Comics flourished, especially starting in the 1980s. And some people would say that creatively, if not financially, they got the upper hand again on Marvel in the late 1980s. In addition to that, there were a lot of new ventures that she led the company on. After she left in 2002, she became a movie producer. Another young woman who made a big impact in a short time was Carole Kalish, who came on board at Marvel in 1981 at about the age of 25. As initially she was hired by the vice president of sales. She was in the circulation business. She had worked for several magazines and a couple of smaller comic companies, and she eventually became the vice president of new product at Marvel, and she was instrumental in the early 80s of changing the trajectory of how Marvel delivered its product, and thereby how all comic companies delivered their product. Now, before this, they were on those spinner racks in grocery stores and gas stations and newsstands, and that was the only place you could find them other than through a subscription. But in the 1970s, and we'll talk more about this later, specialty comics shops started springing up. There weren't a whole lot of them. She started going around and visiting the comics shops and encouraged them to use their funds to get new comics, uh, rather than spending all of their money on trying to get back issues to resale. And she convinced Marvel to have this program where they would actually buy cash registers for comic shops because most of them didn't have one. So she really developed a strong relationship between the company and the specialty comics shops, which led to the direct sales market that we know today, which is the way that most people get their new comic books if they don't get them digitally. So she was very influential, and sadly, she died tragically early of a brain embolism when she was only 36. But she was recognized with all kinds of major awards from the industry, even at her young age. Karen Berger came to work for DC in 1979, right out of college, as an editorial assistant to Paul Levitz. And before very long, she was an editor in her own right, asking to be in charge of the DC horror comics, House of Mystery and the Swamp Thing, because that was the genre that she was fondest of. And over the course of the 1980s, she guided DC, particularly the horror titles, towards some really high quality work, working with people like Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman. Eventually, eventually with Neil Gaiman beginning his legendary run on Sandman under her editorial reign. Then in 1993, she encouraged the higher ups at DC to take a gamble and start an imprint called Vertigo, which they did, in which she wound up being the executive editor on, later the senior vice president, in charge of the Vertigo imprint, which was for mature audiences only. Now, DC was still going the route, actually everyone just about was in the early 90s, still going the route of getting that CCA stamp and getting approved by the censors. But the Vertigo imprint would have have a big M on it for mature, and would open the door for more complex and sophisticated and adult stories. So under that imprint, Sandman and Swamp Thing were moved there, and later things like V for Vendetta and Preacher, also Hellblazer starring John Constantine. All those things came through Vertigo, which was extremely, extremely successful, both financially and critically. She finally left Vertigo and DC in 2013 and wound up at Dark Horse Comics, which we haven't talked about because they did not exist during the time period we've been discussing. But she is at the head of an imprint there called Berger Books that is all creator owned. So she's kind of working on starting from the ground up to rebuild Dark Horse's own version of Vertigo. So she is a highly, highly respected figure in the industry, highly respected and admired. Now, Florence Steinberg, or Flo, or as Stan Lee dubbed her, Fabulous Flo, is also an extremely highly regarded figure in the comics industry, especially from anyone who worked at Marvel in the 60s and 70s. Flo Steinberg, in 1963, when she was 24 years old, got a job as Stan Lee's secretary. It actually paid a little bit better than some of the other jobs that she had looked at. And so she came on board and was at that time one of only 2 full-time staff employees at Marvel Comics, Stan Lee and her as his secretary. Because remember, Martin Goodman had downsized and he hadn't upsized yet. Now we're getting a little ahead of the narrative, but the first issue of Fantastic Four came out in November 1961. Then the first appearance of the Hulk the following year. 1963 is when the popularity of Marvel's new superheroes started to explode. So she came in just in time for that huge swell in popularity, and that kept her very busy. It was her job to, various different things. She had to answer all the fan mail, and they started getting a lot. I mean, a lot. They probably got as much fan mail as all the other companies put together in the mid-60s. She had to answer the fan mail. She had to stop people who just wandered in off the street and wanted to see the comic book offices, especially little kids that tried to run past her. And she had to deal with the freelancers, the artists and scripters who were wanting to pitch ideas and were trying to get past her to the boss, right? And as you can see in the upper left, she actually wound up showing up from time to time, as drawn there by Jack Kirby, in some of the issues. In 1968, she quit over a wage dispute. It was a whole lot of work, and she was getting worn out, and she had asked for a $5 a week raise, and it wasn't forthcoming. Probably had a lot more to do with Martin Goodman than anybody else. So she quit. She quit and tried to find editorial work, and turns out she had made a lot of friends in the comic business, a lot of creative types. And a lot of the people who were on the ground floor of starting the underground comics movement, which we'll be talking about in great depth later, wound up being people that she had known when they were living and trying to work in New York City. And now many of them had moved out to San Francisco, which is where the flower power hippie movement and the underground comics, which was really an extension of that, was happening. So 1974-75, she winds up out there in San Francisco, and she starts, she edits her own comic book that she got several of those underground artists like Trina Robbins, for example, we'll be talking about in a moment, to contribute to Big Apple Comics. And also some of the aspiring artists and writers who had been trying to break in at Marvel and hadn't quite made it yet, but were on the verge of doing so. So in many ways, Big Apple Comics, edited by Florence Steinberg, was sort of a transitional phase between the underground comics movement and what we would today call the independent comics movement. And she was fundamental in that and remained active in it throughout the rest of her life, although she came back to Marvel in the 90s. I think it was a part-time basis, I'm not sure, but doing some line editing and copy reading and stuff like that. And that is a good segue into talking about some women who were extremely important in the underground comics movement. Again, we'll talk about that more later, but just so that you know what I'm talking about, that's the sort of comics that were being put out in the late 60s and early 70s, up until the mid-70s, that really the epicenter for that was San Francisco. They were independent. They weren't mass market. A lot of times they were just mimeographed, on a copy machine and stapled together and sold individually, sometimes in head shops where you could buy other types of paraphernalia of different types, and did not have to conform to any kind of censorship because they were sold directly by the creators, right? Well, Trina Robbins was one of the most important figures in that movement, and really is one of the most important figures in the comics industry in the last half century, maybe all the way through. Trina Robbins, a writer and an artist who, in the early 70s at Berkeley, was on the staff of a feminist newspaper, the feminist newspaper called "It Ain't Me, Babe," which is from the Johnny Cash song. And she started doing cartoons in the newspaper, and in 1970, then 1972, put together an anthology of comic strips from various different female writers and artists called "It Ain't Me, Babe." Then she helped to start a regular ongoing anthology series called Women's Comics, which you can see there. In the first issue, Trina Robbins wrote and drew a story called "Sandy Comes Out," about a young woman coming out as a lesbian. And that was the first time that lesbians were featured in any kind of comic strip or comic book outside the bounds of, pornographic stuff. And so that made it a very significant story, and it also really set the tone for the kinds of, at that time, very controversial topics that Trina Robbins and those like her were taking on, boldly taking on. Later, in the 80s, she had made quite a name for herself, and she wound up being the writer and artist of a new Wonder Woman series, The Legend of Wonder Woman, making her, in 1986 when this started, making her in the 46-year history up to then of Wonder Woman, the first female artist to draw the solo adventures of Wonder Woman. Now, there have been a couple of women who had written for Wonder Woman, starting the first one in the late 40s, just as a fill-in. But took almost half a century for a woman to draw Wonder Woman. And that woman was Trina Robbins, who still is active, both in a lot of ways, but also within the conventional comics industry. So, Trina Robbins, another of the most important female artists of the underground comics movement, was Aline Kaminsky, who had a strip called Bunch. Now, sometimes she has been overshadowed by her husband, underground comics artist Robert Crumb. She actually goes by Aline Kaminsky Crumb. They got married back in the 70s. And they do a lot of work together. They collaborate a lot. But on her own merit, she is one of the most important underground comics artists of the 70s. I think it's unfortunate that she gets overshadowed by her husband. And Crumb, by the way, is kind of like the epitome of the underground comics artist in the eyes of most people who are even passingly familiar with it. All right, well, one other person to talk about in this regard, Kathryn Ironwood, who started off in the late 60s writing science fiction short stories, a few of which were published in various science fiction magazines. They weren't called pulps anymore. The pulps had pretty well died off, but there were some digest-sized science fiction magazines. And throughout the 1970s, she became known to comics fans of Marvel and DC due to the fact that she also, like Mary Jo Duffy, was a frequent letter writer. In fact, a lot of people that wound up as writers at Marvel and DC first appeared in print in the letters pages. So she had a very sophisticated worldview as expressed in those letters, fan letters pages. In the late 70s, she got a job as an editor at the Kitchen Sink Press, which was one of the foundational underground comics publishers. But by the early 80s, they had kind of branched out, and a lot of their stuff was actually considered kind of high-end. In fact, because they usually didn't have big print runs, they were kind of expensive, and their back issue value often went way up. And in particular, one thing that she worked on that Kitchen Press became well known for in the 80s was they reprinted all of the Will Eisner Spirit comic strips from the 1940s. And again, it was considered like a very high-end item. Then in the mid-80s, she got in on the ground floor as the chief editor at a new company called Eclipse Comics. And we'll be talking about them later on when we get to the 80s and the independent companies. But among other things, that was some of the first, Eclipse Comics saw some of the first American work by the aforementioned Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman. So she continues to work in comics as a writer and an editor and a critic. She had a column for a long time in a prominent comics fan magazine, a trade journal. She also, and this has been true since the 60s really, deeply involved in folk magic. In fact, that's one of the first things that she published, that she wrote, was that she put together a compendium of all the spells Dr. Strange had used and had that self-published. So anyway, she's a fascinating person. I follow her on social media and interact with her from time to time, and she is just absolutely fascinating still.